God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. In 1914, a storm was about to engulf Europe, the like of which it had never experienced before. And a few weeks ago, I came face to face with the reality of it. There in front of me was the War Memorial for the thousands of men from Leicester, city and county, who went off to war and never came back. Let me take you back a bit to how I'd got to that point. I was on the bus, and knowing this sermon prep was coming up, I read the passage from John 11 we've just heard. I then got off at the top of London Road and walked towards the gates of the entrance to Victoria Park. I'd driven past them countless times before, of course, and probably walked through them as well, but I'd never stood and gazed at them. I then carried on through the park, where the serenity of it brought to mind the wonderful song, "Be Still, for the Presence of the Lord." I walked on to the memorial and onto University Road. As I was sitting in the bright September sunshine, all around me was life, with students from all walks of it. And in front of me, over the road, was death, with the edge of Welford Road Cemetery. And there I began to write this sermon, with the following framework that will be built on in the days to come. If you believe, you will know the presence of God. If you believe, you will experience the power of God. If you believe, you will see the glory of God. I was still, for the presence of the Lord, the Holy One, was there. And that same God, the resurrection and the life, is with us now, as we consider this momentous passage before us. As a student myself of music many years ago, it came home to me that something happened in that realm in the early 20th century that was accelerated by World War I. Gone were the sweeping melodies of the Romantic era, replaced by a more disjointed, atonal approach. The same thing happened in the visual arts as well, and more ominously in theology. For the horrors of the trenches would have played their part, as old certainties were swept away. Where was God when such things were allowed to happen? How could anyone believe any more? A week before these trains of thought that led to this sermon, I was listening to Radio 5 Live whilst cooking tea. For many, this was the back to work day, and so they were running a reasons to be cheerful item where listeners submitted some if they could find any. But for those in the Great War grappling with unfolding events, there were reasons to be doubtful, and for Mary in this great passage, she was struggling as well. If you have a Bible or device, come with me to John 11 and verse 21 to see what she said to Jesus. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." For this grieving sister, there were reasons to be doubtful. Her brother Lazarus was ill, as we read back in verse 1. And along with her sister Mary, Martha had sent word to Jesus that the one he loved was ill. Notice she doesn't say, "Please, can you come?" although you may have thought would have been implied. Presumably, that's what she wanted, but that's not what she got. And because she didn't have the benefit of verse 4 from her point of view, Jesus quite literally hadn't turned up. This was not because he didn't care. John points out in verse 5 that Jesus loved Mary and Martha and her sister and Lazarus. But for Martha, 2 days on from the original message, nothing. It's like she'd been blue ticked, except she didn't know Jesus had seen the message. There was nothing, and now her brother was dead. So it was too late. And she wasn't the only one. For before Jesus' arrival in verse 17, doubts were expressed by his disciples, partly about the wisdom of going back to Judea in the first place. Was it really a good idea to return to a place where Jesus had had an attempt on his life? Why is he putting himself in danger just to wake someone up? How can Jesus say such a thing as that he was glad he wasn't there when Lazarus died, so they could believe? And then there's Thomas, who seemed to have more reasons to be doubtful than all the other disciples, saying in verse 16, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." All this somewhat troubled build-up is the context to the "I am" of Jesus we read in verse 25. I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And it's this question that follows that leads us into the first of our headings. If you believe, you will know the presence of God. For Martha, the presence of the Lord would have made all the difference. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. For Mary too, the Lord being there would have been key. Verse 32. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. For Mary and Martha, the presence of the Lord wasn't all about words. What was Jesus' answer to Mary's difficult statement in verse 32? Was it a theological exposition on the afterlife? Was it a rebuke on the lines of, "Don't talk to me like that"? Or was it just possible that his response was a song without words, a lament from the heart, that was the evidence that Jesus loved Mary, Martha, and their brother Lazarus? For we read in verse 33 that Jesus was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. The only thing he says is, "Where have you laid him?" And when invited to come and see, he wept. This may be Scripture's shortest verse, but it speaks volumes of the Saviour's love and compassion. The fact is that the presence of God can be experienced in all sorts of ways. The start of this sermon prep was quite literally a walk in the park. Heaven above was brighter blue. Earth below was sweeter green. Something lives in every hue Christless eyes have never seen. Psalm 19 verse 1. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. I believed that the Lord would help me write this sermon, and I knew his presence at the outset of its composition. If we believe when faced with an issue that may be far more serious, we can know his presence and help. Recently, I read the story of a man brought up in South Wales, which illustrates quite literally the presence of God in the valley. I'll let him tell you in his own words. Each year, he said, when I was a child, we were taken to an open day at the steel works where my dad worked. It was a really enjoyable family day out with rides and other entertainment. Consequently, for me, the words open day became synonymous with such a fun event. However, on a hot summer Saturday in 1977, that changed, when Dad took the whole family to an open day at the local sewage works. There were no rides, no children's entertainers, no stalls, but there was one thing there in abundance, the smell. It was so bad my mum refused to leave the car and remained there with the windows closed the whole time we were there. She must have come close to getting heat stroke. However, it was free, and my dad got to test the whole family's gagging reflexes to boot. So where is this leading? Well, in biblical times, there were no sewage treatment works, and everything unpleasant used to get discharged, one way or the other, on the east side of the cities. Even the poor were buried there. To the east side of Jerusalem, between the city of the Mount of Olives, there is the Kidron Valley, which contains the Kidron Brook. In its day, this was an open sewer that took discharge from the temple, amongst other places. As you can imagine, in the climate of the Middle East, the smell was pretty ripe. There are several mentions made in the Bible of this valley, but two of the most poignant are firstly in 2 Samuel 15, where King David flees through the Kidron Valley and into the wilderness from his son's Absalom's rebellion against him. And then in John 18, Jesus, King David's descendant, crosses over the Kidron on his way to Gethsemane before his arrest, trial, and crucifixion. King David fled into an uncertain future, but he still clung to the fact that God had made him king. He probably wondered if this was how it was to end, overthrown, running like a thief into exile. Scripture and history tells us this was not the case. God still had his hand on David. He was Israel's anointed king, and nothing was going to stand in the way of God's plans. Now let's leap forward to see Jesus take that same journey across the Kidron to Gethsemane. He knew what was ahead of him. He even prayed to God in his humanity that if there was another way to fulfill the plan of salvation, to be spared what lay ahead. However, Jesus knew the future didn't end at Calvary. There was the resurrection to come. Sometimes it seems as though life is just wading through something unspeakable, with seemingly no end in sight. But we can take comfort in the fact that Jesus knows that experience. He will walk alongside us in it, and if needs be, carry us through it and out the other side. We need to hold on to his promises, seek God's face as to where he wants us to be. He will lead us through this to something that will amaze us in due time. Then we will be able to look back and say, God was with me in that. Let's move on to our second point. If you believe, you will experience the power of God. Look at verse 38. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there is a bad odour, for he has been there 4 days. If the doc was there from Back to the Future, he'd have said, Martha, you're not thinking fourth dimensionally. But with the presence of the great physician there, the power of God was about to be experienced by all who witnessed it. It may be, like Martha, that in your time of need, the Lord asks you to do something totally illogical. But we're not thinking in the spiritual dimension that God is operating in. What are the stones you need to take away in order for you to witness God's power firsthand? Of course, Lazarus could have just appeared on the other side of the stone, as if by magic, like the shopkeeper in Mr. Benn. But this was not the work of a magician. It was the wonderful power of the Master. And what followed would have been an extraordinary moment in the lives of all who saw it. If you're a Christian listening to this, then you have already experienced the power of God. As Paul wrote to the Ephesians, as for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins, in which you used to live when you followed the ways of this world and of the ruler of the kingdom of the air. But because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ, even when we were dead in transgressions. It is by grace you have been saved. This is the good news of the gospel, which is, to quote Paul's letter to the Romans, the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. A young boy travelling by plane to visit his grandparents sat beside a man who happened to be a college professor, and who noticed he was reading a Sunday school take-home paper. Young man, said the professor, if you can tell me something God can do, I'll give you a big shiny apple. The boy thought for a moment and then replied, if you can tell me something God can't do, I'll give you a whole barrel of them. My God is so big, so strong, and so mighty, there's nothing that he cannot do. We sung this every Wednesday morning since the dawn of time at the Ark, and still we don't always believe it. If you believe, you will experience the power of God. The power of the gospel I referenced from Romans. Power over sin and temptation that is promised to the believer. The power he equips us with to stand up against the enemy, Satan. And if you don't believe as yet, you too can experience the power of God when you do. It may be that, like your forefathers just over a century ago, you have reasons to be doubtful based on your own experience and the state of the world around you. The how can a God of love question, to which there are no easy answers. Perhaps, like Martha, you feel you have a logical reason for not believing in what the Lord can do, that he's asking you to do something which doesn't make sense. Just imagine if verse 41 said, so they didn't take away the stone, based on the nauseous smell they would have encountered. A kind of sliding doors or stones moment. Would that have been that? Those of us who are Christians can only imagine, although perhaps it's best not to, what a life of unbelief would have looked like, and where it might have taken us, if the stone stayed where it was. But I can say with complete confidence, if you believe, you will experience the power of God. Paul writes to the Ephesians of God's incomparably great power for us who believe. That power is the same as the mighty strength he exerted when he raised Christ from the dead and seated him at his right hand in the heavenly realms, far above all rule and authority, power and dominion, and every name that is invoked, not only in the present age, but also in the one to come. Henry was a missionary who worked in remote areas of Africa 100 years ago. He used his skills as a linguist to teach the natives to read, and in every village he started by building a school hut with bamboo walls and a thatched roof. But everywhere he went, he had to put up with the hostility of the local witch doctors, who saw what Henry was doing as undermining their role and threatening their religion. On one occasion, the local witch doctor told Henry that if he didn't leave the village, the tribe's god would burn the school to the ground. Henry wasn't afraid of the tribal gods, but he was afraid that the witch doctor might try to set fire to his hut. So it came as a shock to all concerned when in the early hours of the morning there was an almighty storm, and lightning hit the school and burned it to the ground. Early the next morning, the witch doctor appeared with his followers and told Henry to leave. But Henry, in a sudden burst of God-given boldness, said that his God, the God of the Bible, was more powerful than his tribe's God. That very night, Henry said, the village totem pole will be struck by lightning and destroyed. As soon as the witch doctor had gone, Henry began to wonder what on earth he'd done. Everyone in the village had heard what he'd said. There was no going back. All he could do was pray. And pray he did. Early the following morning, there was a great flash of lightning, and the village totem pole was destroyed. Henry stayed. The school was rebuilt. The people learned to read and believed in Henry's God. And so we've seen that if you believe, you will know the presence of God and experience the power of God. Thirdly and finally, if you believe, you will see the glory of God. This is a direct quote from the Lord himself, but you'll see from where it's taken in verse 40 that it's actually part of a question. Then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? This question was in response to Martha's own reluctance to take away the stone, and what she saw as her practical reasons for it. But Jesus had indeed told her back in verse 25, when he had made that I am statement, saying, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Whilst I was preparing this, I noticed something about the sequence of events I'd not spotted before. I'd always thought Jesus' words, if you believe, you will see the glory of God, come after the resurrection of Lazarus. A bit like Jesus saying, there you go, what did I tell you? But they're actually spoken before the stone is even taken away, let alone what follows afterwards. Look at verse 41. So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. This is what it's all about. We come now to the very dramatic verse 43. When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen, and a cloth round his face. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Now, when I put this series together, I stopped this passage at verse 44, but really I could have done with adding verse 45, which has the kind of belief Jesus was speaking of. So let's do it. Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did, believed in him. John, who wrote this account as part of his gospel, already did. He was the living embodiment of Jesus' words in verse 40 being put into practice. He wrote in the opening to his gospel, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. And for us, 2,000 years on, if we know and love the Lord, if we believe in him, then we have seen his glory. We have seen it in creation, as I've already mentioned. We have seen it in our salvation, for he has saved us. We have seen it in his redemption, for he has redeemed us, paying the price for our sin on the cross. But to quote a song we sing at Easter, believing in God's Son, the best is yet to come. Follow him and heaven is in store. Heaven brings together the presence, power, and glory of the Lord that those who've gone before us are currently experiencing. Describing the great multitude in white robes in Revelation 7, it says, they are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will shelter them with his presence. What a lovely image that is, sheltered by the presence of God. The power of God can also be seen through the book of Revelation. The verse I picked out actually has power and glory rolled into one, Revelation 15:8, saying, the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power. But I can't resist adding another verse from the Bible's last book, which shows what belief will lead to. A heavenly picture from Revelation 21 and verse 23. The city does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light, and the Lamb is its lamp. God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. At the time, the players in this drama hadn't understood why the Lord had moved the way he did. Why he hadn't moved at all, staying where he was while Lazarus went downhill. There had been a lot of pain and hurt, frustration to the point of anger. But God was moving, and his wonders, when performed, would have had a profound effect on those who witnessed them. The day I began composing this sermon, I wrote of a metaphorical storm. The day I finished it, a week later, we were in one, if not technically, but it was still very windy around a month ago. This week marks the anniversary of the Great Storm of '87, which I remember vividly as the trees in the park had fallen on the road, meaning I couldn't get to college. Even the weatherman, the hapless Michael Fish, hadn't believed that I was coming. But £2 billion later, and with sadly a number of lives lost, we knew its effects. But the fact is that whilst what Jesus said was true, if you believe, you will see the glory of God, as are my opening 2 points. If you believe, you will know the presence of God and experience the power of God, the opposite is also true. For there will come a time when believers and unbelievers alike will know his presence, experience his power, and see his glory. And I would rather witness these things as a believer than as a non-believer. Here lies a warning for each one of us. For those of us who believe, we need to hold on to that, enveloped as we are in a storm of secularism, godlessness, and at times hostility. And for those who don't, the coming storm may be dismissed, but it will take place, and no one will escape its effects. So bring to God the way he moves, your questions and your grief. Know his presence, power, glory too. Hold on to your belief. And if you wonder how on earth you can believe in him, trust in God and his new birth, and know his power within.